Hi everyone, this is Mike Mueller-Smith here. Happy to welcome you to the H2D2 session 3C on labor markets and migration. I just want to give everyone a heads up that this presentation is being recorded. We have two excellent presenters with us today, Daniel Osuna Gomez from the University of Texas Austin, as well as Yogita Shamdasani from the University of Pittsburgh. I'm really excited to see these presentations. We only have two presenters in this session, so we're going to give each of our presenters a little bit longer, 22 minutes, to discuss their work, and I'll give them 5-minute warnings. If you have questions about the papers, please submit them via the event chat function. If you can take a minute to locate that now, enter the questions as you have them during the talk, and I'll read them off to the presenters at the end. And with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Daniel, who's going to be giving us the first talk. Daniel, if you could, your microphone's on, and if you could share your screen, that would be great.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to start the presentation 133 up to 155. Thank you very much for coming, to watching our presentation. I am Daniel Osuna Gomez. I am just about to graduate from the University of Texas at Austin, and this is my job market paper. It's named The Decapitation of Criminal Organizations and the Labor Market. Pretty much this paper deals with the really large criminal organizations. And these are, what I'm referring here, I'm talking about organizations that profit from crime and have national size impact. These organizations, I'm talking about, for example, the Mexican cartels, the Italian Mandangreta, these are a worldwide problem. So, for example, during 2009, they earned $870 billion, or 1.5% of global GDP. And these are problem not just because they are not paying taxes, but the problem is that they profit from, for example, drug trafficking. That's half of their profits, which result in very serious problems, like the loss of a lot of young people's lives. Some of them have been even found to be helping terrorist organizations because they profit from poppy. For example, Al-Qaeda, a lot of its profits come from the sale of cocaine. And moreover, they also profit from other criminal activities like human trafficking, or smuggling of immigrants. Actually, there are estimated, these data are from the United Nations, and it is estimated that around half of the immigrants from the rest of Latin America to the US actually have been aided or helped by the cartels in Latin America. So this is a big problem, and governments are trying to decide what to do. And this is the question that my paper is trying to solve, is a policy designed to attack this organization, which is the decapitation of the organization. When I say decapitation, I am referring to the arrest or the killing of the leader of the organization. This is not a new strategy. It has been used by the US during the prohibition with Al Capone. In Italy, with the mafia, actually 2018, there was a big capture on the Mandangreta, Colombia, Pablo Escobar. This is something that for countries is very, so they think it's cost effective because with a single bullet, with a single arrest, you can affect really, really large enterprises. But the problem is then you still need to measure what are the consequences, the full consequences of this. So of course you have the loss of leadership in the organization. I would compare it to the sudden death of a CEO. The only difference, for example, between a Mexican cartel and Amazon is that legal firms have legal codes and procedures that guarantee what happens once the CEO dies. And here you don't have it. So the remaining cartel members might fight for power, which reduces local crime. This has further consequences. So for example, if they are fighting for power, they might say, oh, we still need additional resources to fight for power. So they might recur to crime extortion, kidnappings, and other types of crime. Overall, these are really difficult policy to study. because these are rare occurrences within a country. So yeah, across the world, there's going to be around 1 or 2 big captures every year, but in different countries. But within a country, these captures happen once every blue moon. And once they happen, they might affect a whole country because I am talking about really large organizations. So yeah, there are not a lot of settings where you can study this, but still, countries still want to apply it. So here I am studying what's the impact of this policy on the labor market. And it is a shock. It has ambiguous consequences. You can make theories of what will happen, but you might find contradictory possibilities. For example, it might lower the aggregate demand. So if you kill the head of a criminal organization, the remaining cartel members might fight. There might be an increase in local violence, which might make people stop wanting to go out and consume local services and non-tradable goods as they used before. They might just say, I don't want to go out to eat in a restaurant if there's a shooting next to the restaurant. It might also lower the labor supply. People might say, I don't want to work because it's like outside of home because it's very violent, or they might just change the composition of the labor force. It might be harder to get policemen. Or it might be that it lowers labor demands. Firms might need to hire additional security costs, which might diminish their profits, which might make them fire people. But if you see all these effects, it might make like wages go up for those that remain in the labor market. It might make wages go down. So it is kind of an ambiguous result here. So here, the Mexico war on drugs is a unique setting to study this question, because between 2007 and 2008, they had multiple unexpected captures. These captures were the result of a change in policy by the government. There was an increase in the local violence in the home city of the newly elected president, Felipe Calderon. And he decided to take this violent event. He decided this policy for this violent event, and he took it to a national level. It was not part of his political campaign to get elected, so no one was expecting it. And there's actually no records of someone expecting this to happen afterwards. And the initial perception of this policy was that the impact wouldn't be an increase in violence. No one was actually foreseeing this effect. And as I said, it's multiple because Mexico has multiple cartels in Mexico. And they happen across different time periods, and they were the result of errors in the security teams of the cartel leaders in Mexico, which I could, of course, go in more detail with the questions. There's a spatial heterogeneity in cartel location. So the cartels in Mexico, they are not located in the same regions. There's some overlapping in some municipalities. Municipalities are like counties. In some counties, there are multiple cartels, but overall, the cartels have different areas of operation, and you have different dates of captures between cartel leaders. And we can see that there's a large change in criminal activity after each capture. So this is not just after one capture or a particular subset of captures. I have seen this among the 5 major cartels. After the capture of the 5 major cartel leaders. And overall, there's detailed data on employment, consumption, and household characteristics. And this is very important because when you have a huge increase in violence, there might be some concerns that data quality might be affected. In Mexico, we have the INEGI, the Institute of Statistics, and they actually even cooperated with the military to keep the quality of the data in regions of really high violence. And this is in contrast to other studies that they have this problem in other countries. So this is a very unique setting where we have heterogeneity in location, exogeneity in the timing of the policy, and we still have quality data. So I use all of this. I use the captures timing to estimate causal effects through a difference in difference analysis. In other words, I am just comparing regions with cartel presence against regions without cartel presence before and after the leaders are captured. There are multiple variations, other specifications for these analyses, but the results are similar, and I will talk about it in the robustness checks if we have time. What I find is that decapitation has a terrible impact. It caused a decrease of 5% in wages. If you compare it to the China trade shock in Mexico, that's a 3%. Depending on the estimates, it's very similar to the China trade shock, a little bit smaller than the Great Recession. It also had impact on paid employment, a decrease of 1.3 percentage points, which was caused by an increase in unpaid work. This is consistent with the literature on macro shocks, so pretty much it behaves very similar to other macro shocks in the sense that it increases the percentage of the percentage of the working force working in informal employment. It has larger effects for low-skilled workers, which is what we expect. And if I don't have time to talk about mechanisms, I just want to tell you this is driven by firm destruction, particularly by the destruction of very small, by very young firms. So how do I do this study? Let me talk about data. I am using this data created by Cosio and Rios to find where the cartels operate within Mexico. Pretty much, it searches the news articles and reports linking municipalities with cartels' areas of operation. So pretty much, the cartels have the incentive to signal where they were operating to deter the entrance of other cartels into their localities and also to deter military operations. So what they did is to put banners with dead people to the sides to signal that they were there, and then the news reports come and they report it and they upload it to their websites. Like, oh, in this municipality, county, at this date, we found this banner stating that this cartel was operating. One thing that I have to clarify is that one treatment outcome is that cartels expanded. So that will be an endogenous variable. So I need to restrict my sample to restrict my treatment group to the municipalities with cartels before any capture. This would only bias downward my estimates. So pretty much all my results will be an underestimation of the true impact of violence in Mexico. I have done several robustness checks on this and it doesn't change the main conclusions. Let me show. This is the map of Mexico, and where the cartels are located. Cartels are widespread. There are two things. I have checked if there's something that could foresee where the cartels are located. Pretty much I can see two things. Being close to the border and also on large urban areas, which I have a check on the robustness checks of my analysis. The results are very robust. But overall, there's also no sample to do other subsamples of my study. This data is fused with, I have 10 minutes. It's fused with, it's merged with the following data sets: the National Employment Survey for labor outcomes, vital statistics for the murder rate, the population and firm censuses for data on the migration, population, and firm outcomes, and the Consumer Survey of Mexico, which is called the National Household Survey of Expenditure and Income. My regression model, it's a very simple difference model with different treatment periods. Here, my outcome of interest are several labor outcomes. The variable of interest is cartel times post, which is a dummy equal to 1 for municipalities with cartel presence after the kingpin relevant to that municipality has been captured. I did add municipality fixed effects, time fixed effects, state by year by quarter fixed effects to try to control for state level policies. And here the coefficient of interest is beta. I want to make emphasis on this because this identifies the causal effect on wages or employment of cartel decapitation. This includes the effect of increasing violence, but also the increase in other types of crime like firm extortion, like kidnapping. So it is, this is why this study cannot be done as an IV, where the murder rate is exogenous shifted by the capture of the kingpin. So yes. For this analysis to hold, two key assumptions must hold. The first one, conditional independence, which is just that the choice whether a municipality gets treated or not is not correlated to possible outcomes. It is really hard to test, but health trends prior to treatment are suggestive. So I will show the parallel trends here. This is the average wage. The vertical line shows the capture of the first in pink. So as you can see, like both regions with cartel and no cartel, they follow each other very closely before the capture, and it takes like a year before it actually both series diverge. And this is not just for the wages; it's the same for employment. And this happens after each capture. This is one cartel that I chose in particular, the Forest cartel, but it happens for every single cartel. The second assumption is that the response of a particular unit depends only on the treatment to which it was assigned, not the treatment of others, which might be violated by migration and spillovers. I would like to talk about migration because it's expected. I don't see changes in population size. Most studies haven't found migration as a result of violence, except in this new study by Aldeco Leo Lorenzo, which what happened is that the effect is so small. It's like 33,000 people that were that needed to migrate because of violence. That in most studies, any coefficient on migration will be non-significant. And in my results, my coefficients are not sensitive to this migration. The work by Viridiana Rios has actually found several municipalities that are the regions that have created more migrants because of violence. And we know also where they might be going. So you can easily control for migration, and it's not a big, it doesn't cause identification problems here. For estimation and inference, I am doing this OLS regression. The clustering here is a little bit complicated because there might be several options. I am doing a lot of them. If we go by the work of Abadi and the others, if we do this by design base, we should cluster by municipality, which I do it back in parentheses, because the surveys that I am using are significant at the municipality level, municipalities like a county again. And if we do it experiment based, we should be clustering by cartels. As there are a few cartels, I cluster on cartel combination, which leverage the fact that there are some municipalities with multiple cartels, which that will be in brackets. Overall, the analysis is not sensitive to changing the cluster strategy. I have done several other specifications, like at state level, state cartel combination, and it doesn't change because the coefficients are quite large. So yes, I can do. There's a whole robustness check on the clustering strategy. This is what I found.
I just want to give you a heads up. You have 5 minutes left.
Okay, so this is what I found. Wages decrease a year after the decapitation. So as I said before, it decreases. It takes a year, so before we can see the results. And the same thing with employment. Although employment reacts a little bit faster, it takes between 7 and 12 months before we see the first decay in paid employment. There's a lot of like robustness checks that I have done. I have replicated in the population census or using different subsamples, changing the variable definition, eliminating single cartel from analysis, doing different cluster strategies, adding individual fixed effects. With more time, I would say why I am not doing this for the main analysis. I have also done pre-trend tests on other municipality characteristics with no effect. Additional controls, so for example, if this is driven by the election of the president against like just the capture, I have done treatment intensity to see if the regions with multiple cartels are the ones driving this result. Multiple hypothesis testing. I have even done the Goodman decomposition, which I didn't have ready for this presentation. So about the mechanisms, like I have 4 minutes. So the mechanisms about consumer demand, I don't see this. So the idea here is lower local demand will be changed because of consumer behavior. And I see that not only services or non-tradable goods are affected. So for example, actually firms that export are being affected in their production. So this is not just products and firms that depend on the local market. And even households not affected by shocking wages did not change consumer behavior, which says that this is not just driven by wages. Even if I exclude high tourism areas, I don't see that this is driving any results. About labor supply, this might be a thing about violence and fear. The thing is, like, I haven't seen any result that is consistent with this story. For example, occupations with high risk getting higher pay. I don't see anything. Groups of high that are more exposed to risk are not being paid more. So I haven't seen any evidence on this. And the last one is higher cost, which is driven by the firms, which I have seen changes in firm behavior, but probably I will not have a lot of time for that. So pretty much what I have seen is that like the decapitation indirectly kills firms, especially younger firms are more vulnerable. I don't see that it is through their revenue. I don't see that it's through their cost. They do fire people. So all this evidence, in addition to news reports and other studies, hints towards an increase in cost through increasing safety costs and firm extortion. So as a conclusion, because we are very, very short on time, cartel decapitation caused a decrease of 5% in wages and decreasing 1.3 percentage points in paid employment. This is very similar to the China trade shock, half effect of the Great Recession on wages. This is very similar to other macro shocks, as we have seen that informal and less educated workers are affected the most, and especially like it makes the labor market more informal. About the mechanisms, so there's like some like it is one possible mechanism are firm destruction, although the evidence on violence and fears is not as conclusive. This is my presentation. Thank you very much. I can now I can answer questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel, so much. That was really fantastic. So I just want to encourage attendees, if you want to ask a question, please feel free to use the event chat. I think that there's another function where you can raise your hand. I cannot promise I can actually execute on that. So feel free to enter your questions to the event chat. I've got a few to start us off for Daniel. One of the things that you talked about that I thought was really interesting, in general I find to be an important issue, is just how data availability steers the questions that we can ask. So you raised this issue about how often in these contexts with violence and cartels that we often don't have the data available. And so in this situation, we have a unique environment where the census is collaborating with, I believe, the military, you said, so that they can still get into dangerous places to collect relevant socioeconomic data. What do you think about the quality of those records? Do you think that there might be a differential attrition rate or non-response bias based off of the fact that they're aligned with the government, and how that might interact with whether or not a cartel has been decapitated, as you said?
So I would say two things about it. Number one, that's why it's so important to check with other data sets. The main analysis here was using the employment survey, which I would say is the less, like the one that might have problems with this. The population census, everyone has to fill it by law. So I did check it with the population census, and it doesn't change. And you can also exclude like really like areas with really high levels of violence to see if this is driven by like problems it captures, like with problems in, for example, let's say Tijuana or Acapulco, like cities like with extreme levels of violence. And it is not the case. And I actually talked with the people in charge of this, and they did have a record of cities where they have problem recollecting data. But pretty much that's what they told me. Like, if we have problem recollecting data, we would just use the military and they would score the people doing the service. But overall, they can pinpoint where this happens. So yes, you can exclude them, do different robustness checks to at least ameliorate this problem.
Great. I want to ask a question from the audience. How about longer term effects? Would other industries or jobs enter the labor market to replace the drug-related jobs in the long run? Great question.
So the problem with the long run is that I would definitely need a different identification strategy. So around my study was finished, I used data up to 2012 because after that there was a new president that came with a different proposal how to target cartels. So, and there were different policies that were applied after the new elected president. So I think like the estimates will be new, so it will be really hard to interpret. So yeah, I would say probably this is not on the scope of my study, but if someone can come up how to disentangle this, they have a paper.
Great. I have another question, and I think we still have a little bit of time. So please, if you have questions to the audience, feel free to enter them into the chat, but I'll take another. So I'm not sure if the mechanisms that you raised cover this. Maybe it was in the demand shock or like consumer demand or labor demand. But how do you think about the cartels themselves as an infusion of cash into a local region and how that might stimulate demand? So, I think about my expertise on this topic is only slightly above watching Narcos on Netflix, but I think about Escobar in Medellin, and he invested a lot in those local communities. And just how do you think about the cartel itself as a driver of demand? And then what do we think about that if removing that source of labor demand results in worse labor market outcomes if the money's coming through illicit or dangerous means?
That's a real possibility, money laundering. That's why I also include that within all the whole group of mechanisms, and it's one that I cannot rule out. So yeah, I cannot rule out the mechanism. I think I should have mentioned it. It's in the paper though. What I can say about that is that there are some reports on which industries are being more likely to be they are more likely to be used by the cartels to money launder. So you can check it by industries, and I haven't seen that only industries where firms are more likely to be money laundered are affected. So I see this across a wide array of industries. Of course, this is not completely definite evidence, but I think it's the only thing you can do at this level. So yes, I cannot say much about it, but it's a possibility.
Great, thanks. All right, last call on questions for Daniel. Okay, we have another excellent presenter that I'm going to turn it over to now. Yogita, I'm turning on your microphone, and Daniel, I'm turning yours off. And Yogita is joining us from the University of Pittsburgh and is going to talk about her work on labor rationing. Take it away, Yogita.
Great, thanks so much, Mike. Okay, so I'm going to share screen. Can you guys see my screen?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay.
I'll give you a 5-minute reminder.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for being here. Thanks, Mike, and to the organizers for putting this virtual session together. It's been a fun, different day. So I'm excited to present some new work that I have with two co-authors, Emily Briza and Supreet Kaur. This is a project where we are trying to test for labor rationing using a revealed preference approach, and I'll get into what exactly we mean by that. So let me first start with just motivating this project in big picture. So if we empirically look at employment rates in developing countries for wage employment, we see that this number hovers around 50%. Okay, so in rural India, if we focus on landless prime age males, the employment rate is 45.7%. So the question is then, how should we think about this number? Is it entirely consistent with market clearing, where this is an efficient outcome of a well-functioning labor market? Workers are engaged in other types of activities like self-employment or domestic duties? Or is this consistent with really high levels of involuntary unemployment, which suggests that there are labor market distortions underlying this employment rate, right? So there's sort of been this long-standing debate in development economics about the nature of labor market equilibrium in poor countries. And this is important because it has implications for how we think about the analysis of labor market, as well as how we think about structure of certain policies such as workfare programs, which are a big part of policies in the developing world. Okay, and so at the same time, while we know very well that employment rates and unemployment rates are a key measure for the health of an economy, measuring unemployment still remains to be notoriously hard. So we typically rely on self-reports, for which the reliability can be uncertain. So you could imagine that there are issues with workers who report searching for jobs when they're not actually searching, or just inconsistencies over time in how they report their labor market behavior. Further, you could also think about the fact that workers may not actually be qualified from the employer's perspective, in which case it's no longer about labor market distortions, but about very high reservation wages. And further, we think that this measurement challenge is particularly bad in poor countries because of the fact that we see very high levels of self-employment in these settings. And so the question then becomes, is this high level of self-employment that we observe really meaningful employment, or is it low return self-employment that's really masking disguised unemployment? Okay, and so this sort of has been around in the labor economics literature for a long time, and this quote by Fellner captures how we feel, which is distinguishing elements of voluntariness from elements of involuntariness. The unemployment problem is a hopeless endeavor. Okay, so we're going to try and make this problem a little less hopeless in this paper by asking the question, is there labor rationing? And the way we do this is by using a revealed preference methodology to detect rationing. Okay, so our experiment, essentially what we do is we go in and we generate hiring shocks in local labor markets. And in doing so, what happens is that we take out up to 35% of the labor force of casual male workers. Okay, so we hire them and they're working in external jobs outside the local labor market for close to a month. And at the same time, there's no change in the labor demand in the local village economy. So what this allows us to then do is to use the response in the local labor market to try and diagnose the equilibrium that we're in. So this will allow us to ask the following questions. Does the labor market equilibrium look different across the year? And the way we do this is by running this experiment in different times of the year where there is seasonality in labor demand. So we're going to then be able to compare outcomes of the labor market in lean periods of the year versus more peak labor demand periods of the year. And we're also going to be able to address the second question, which is, does self-employment mask underemployment? So let me tell you a little bit very quickly about the context of this paper. So we're going to be focusing on markets for casual daily labor. So this is an important employment channel for hundreds of millions in India alone, and it's very common in other developing countries. And so a key feature of these markets is that there's high seasonality, right? So we see agricultural demand moving with the agricultural season. And important features about this market that are pretty unique to this casual market is that, firstly, there's a high degree of decentralization and informality. So contracting typically occurs between individual workers and employers. There's no formal institution. And a typical contract is 1 to 3 days, right? And so what I want to highlight here is that the relevant employment margin for us is really a worker day. Okay, so this is somewhat different from the way we think about unemployment duration in the US, where we have these long spells, but really here we're thinking about employment and unemployment at a daily level. And given the structure of this market, what this does is it creates a potential for transitory shocks to impact wages potentially quite quickly. So let me move to telling you about the design of our experiment. Okay, so first off, I'm going to start with a definition of what it means to be rationed, right? So for a worker to be rationed, they have to satisfy two conditions. The first is that they want to supply labor at wage W, but they're unemployed. Okay, so the worker is not on their labor supply curve. The second is that the worker is actually qualified for the job at W. Okay, so this is an important distinction that we want to highlight here, is that the second condition is that the worker is actually employable at wage W. Okay, and for the sake of this paper, we're going to be agnostic on the micro foundation for rationing. So if this was a real seminar where people could be raising their hands, I would have lots of hands asking me why should we expect there to be rationing? So we're not in this paper going to take a stand as to why we see rationing, but for those of you who are interested, I suggest you take a look at this paper by my co-authors who present one potential explanation for rationing. And we're also not going to take a stance on whether or not employed workers are more productive than unemployed workers. Okay, so we're not going to take any stance on what the rationing mechanism is, but this is a project that we're working on right now. Okay, so as I mentioned before, we're going to go in and we're going to generate these hiring shocks. And so the workers are hired into external jobs outside the labor market. And what this does is it causes a reduction in the residual labor supply that remains in the village. Okay, and at the same time, there's no change in labor demand. So this allows us to look at what happens to the local labor market after this supply shock. And so to think about what this looks like under the null of market clearing, what we see here is that we have a hiring shock that causes our supply curve to move to the left. We would expect to see wages go up, which is our first prediction, and we would see aggregate employment falls. Okay, so this is what we would expect under market clearing. Now, suppose instead that we have labor rationing. So this gap that we see here, these are the workers who are rationed out of the labor market. And now we come in and we have the same shift in the supply curve. And if the amount of rationing is weakly greater than the size of this shift, we should firstly see that the wage in the local labor market is not going to respond. Secondly, if we notice that we have the same number of job slots but fewer competitors, and so what this would mean is that for workers who remain in the village, we're going to see employment spillovers for those workers. And finally, we will not expect aggregate employment to change. Okay, so these are our three predictions under rationing. And notice that this is a revealed preference measure, because what this means is that workers who prefer to work at W and workers who are employable at W are the ones who experience these spillovers, right? So both these two conditions have to hold, is that the worker prefers to work at that wage and is employable at that wage in the local labor market. All right, so just to summarize what I showed you so far, so we have sort of two states of the world, the null with market clearing and a world where there is labor rationing. And what we're going to do is we're going to study the impact of our supply shock across different seasons. And so we're going to have a peak season, which we classify as a period of high labor employment in the village. So we're going to use data from our control villages to sort of come up with a distribution of employment levels across the year. And so when I say peak season, I'm going to be referring to a period where there's the above median level of employment. Okay, and so what this allows us to do is it traces out the labor market functioning across the year. Okay, and so you could think about a state of the world where the peak season is represented by this figure here on the left, the lean season by rationing here on the right. So if I have time, I'll also talk about a few potential confounds that some of you might already be thinking about. The first is that the hiring shock itself could lead to demand expansion. So we could see a shift in the demand curve, which could then predict the same patterns that we see, but it's not actually driven by rationing. So we'll talk about that. I'll also talk about the fact that the composition of workers who remain in the village might be changing. And finally, I'll talk about a perfectly elastic labor supply. Okay, so what exactly did we do? So we engineered these transitory hiring shocks, essentially by offering employment in external factories in low-skill manufacturing tasks. So these, the output of that factory project actually shows up in two other papers with some of my co-authors. And this job was a pretty attractive job. So we paid slightly above the prevailing wage of the market, and there were positive compensating differentials, and they were working indoors, they were given lunch, etc. And so one benefit of this is that this allowed us to draw from the entire skill distribution in the village. Okay, and we randomized the shock intensity. So in treatment villages, we hired up to 35% of the labor force And in the control villages, we just hired a handful of workers. So the protocol went as follows. We promoted this job in villages. Workers were given time to sign up, and then we hired a random subset of the workers who signed up. So we have perfect balance in treatment and control villages, and we have 45% of our sample in the lean season and 55 in the peak. Okay, so we have a total of 64 unique labor markets across 5 districts and about 2,500 workers. And in terms of data collection, we conducted a baseline survey before the job offers were made, a survey at endline, a survey 2 weeks after the shock ended, and the key outcome in these surveys was a 10-day recall of all the employment activities that they took part in. Okay, so let's get to the results. So I think I have about 12 minutes. Is that right, Mike? Maybe less. Okay.
About 8-9 minutes left.
Okay, that's perfect. Okay, so in terms of the first set of results, so what we're going to do when I present the results is we're going to look at different samples. The first and the main sample that we study is what we call the spillover sample, which is this area in gray. So the spillover sample refers to workers who signed up for the job but were not offered the job. Right, and so as you can imagine, these are workers who are most similar to those who signed up and were offered the jobs, and are also the group for which we would expect to see employment spillovers. Okay, but we will also consider all workers in the village. So we're going to also, at some point, when looking at aggregate employment, include workers who didn't actually sign up for the job in our analysis. Okay, so recall our first prediction under rationing is that we're not going to see wages change. So what I have here on the left is the lean season, the right is the peak season, and the line in red is the CDF for villages for which there's a hiring shock, and the line in green is villages where there's no hiring shock. Right, and the main thing to take away from this visually before I show you the regression tables is that we see in the peak season a rightward shift in the distribution, in the wage distribution, whereas we don't see any statistically different changes in these two distributions in the lean season. Okay, so this is suggestive of wages going up in the peak season as a result of the shock. Okay, and so the way we present our results here is that we're going to have a simple regression with shock, and shock interacted with peak in the first 3 columns. The fourth column is basically a continuous version of the employment levels in the village, which we use to compute peak, but it essentially tells us the same thing, so we can focus on the first 3 columns. Right, and so what we see here is that there's no detectable change in the wage in the lean season and an increase in the peak season. Okay, so this suggests that the wages adjusted quite quickly in the peak season. And these results look quite similar if we include the full labor force. So right now we're only restricting to these spillover groups. So these are workers, again, who signed up but didn't actually get the job. But we find that if we include the full village, the results look similar. So, this addresses concerns about compositional effects of people who remain in the spillover group. Okay, so moving on to the second prediction on employment, what we predict under rationing is that employment goes up for the spillover group, which is what we find here. Okay, so in the lean season, which is this first row, we find a 38% employment increase for workers who remain, whereas in the peak season, which is summing up these 2 coefficients, we have the p-value here at the bottom of the table. We don't find any change in employment. Okay, so what this is telling us is that we should expect to see a reduction in aggregate employment in the peak season, which is coming out of these individual regressions. And finally, moving to our third prediction on aggregate employment, we find that the prediction is that aggregate employment does not change under rationing. And so here we're going to look at two groups. We're going to look at the full labor force, so everyone who signed up for the job, excluding their employment activity at this external job, and the whole village, so those who signed up as well as those who didn't sign up. And so looking across these two groups, so the first column here is the same result that we had before, employment effects on the spillover sample. Moving to the full labor force and the full village, we see that there's no change in aggregate employment in the lean season, but we find a reduction in aggregate employment in the peak season. So we used our shock as an IV. I'm not going to get into the details of that, but we find this sort of crowd out metric, which is that for every day of work that we created in our job sites, this crowds out 0.149 days of private labor market employment in the peak season. Okay, and so now moving on to our results on self-employment, we, as I mentioned earlier at the start when I motivated the project, we could imagine that ration workers may be engaged in self-employment that might be less profitable. And so this is sort of a classic hypothesis on misallocation from Benjamin to 1992. And so what we see here is that in the lean season, we see a large decline in the rate of self-employment, right? So this is, given that the baseline means are pretty small, this is a 30% decline in the rate of self-employment, which accounts for about 71% of our employment spillovers. Okay, and so what this suggests is that a lot of the self-employment that we observe is actually masking underemployment in the labor market. And finally, what we did was to try and get at involuntary unemployment by asking two different questions. The first is a traditional question that we typically see in surveys like the NSS in India and also, surveys done by the BLS in the US, which is, did you want work but was unable to find any? So that's our first column here. That's the traditional question. And we find a 5% decline, statistically insignificant. Okay, but notice that under this question, you cannot be unemployed if you are self-employed, just by definition. Okay, and so this is going to underestimate rationing because we see that there's high amounts of self-employment. And so then we ask an alternative question, which is, suppose someone offered you work at the prevailing wage in your village on that day, would you have accepted the work? And here we find that the estimates are much closer to our revealed preference response. Okay, so finally, in the last few minutes, I'm going to just go through some of the alternative explanations that might be potential confounds. So the first is this idea that the hiring shock itself could have generated an infusion of wealth in these villages, and that could have caused some expansion of local labor demand. So the way we look at this is we went back into these villages 2 weeks after the experimental job was finished. And so at that point, all the workers are back in the village. And what we find is that in the lean season, the village basically goes back to exactly the way it was before our shock, right? So we don't see any employment effects. And interestingly, in the peak season, we see sort of this persistent decline in employment, which suggests some amount of ratcheting going on. But what this lean season result gives us is that it rules out this expansion of demand as a potential explanation because we don't see any persistent employment effects after the job. And further, we would have expected that we would see even more upward pressure on wages during the time of the shock itself. Okay. So another potential confound could be that the labor supply curve is perfectly elastic. Okay, and so what we do is we sort of measure the implied, we compute the implied elasticity, and our results would require a really large lean season supply elasticity of 6 to 27 to explain that, which seems implausible relative to other estimates in the literature, which estimate a labor supply elasticity closer to 2.
Just a 1 minute warning, just FYI.
Okay, great.
Just a 1 minute warning. Yep.
Okay, perfect. And finally, we think about compositional effects, exploring this idea that workers are heterogeneous in ability, and so just in a quick summary, basically, even if we do find that the average quality of workers who remained in the village after our shock has gone down, our estimates would still be somewhat of a lower bound. Okay, and I'm happy to talk about this further in Q&A. People have questions, but just so I can wrap up in time. So in this paper, we use an experiment to provide the first revealed preference estimates of rationing and a description of market functioning. And sort of the key takeaway that we want to make, the key point we want to make here is that seasonality is really crucial in helping us reconcile the two views of the labor market. Right, so in the lean season, we see substantial rationing, but then in the peak season, we see rapid wage adjustment. And so the takeaway is that any analysis that models market clearing all year round is going to be misleading. And so it's important to take this into account in these settings where seasonality plays an important role in the labor market. All right, thanks so much.
Great. Thanks so much, Yogita. That was fantastic. So I wanted to jump in as moderator and take the first question. It seems like the places where you're locating this labor rationing seems to be places and times when the labor market seems to be breaking down, right? You're finding this in the lean season. That seems to me that there must be like costs of some sort that aren't overcome in terms of renegotiating wages, whereas in the peak season, we can overcome these barriers within the market. Do you have any sense, or do you have any ideas on how you could push your research further in future projects to really kind of trace out where that breaking point is, or is it the duration of the labor extraction, or just things like that?
So some of the work that I mentioned that my co-authors have, what they demonstrate is a reason why you see this rationing in the lean season is that basically workers collude to keep wages high, right? So there's like social sanctions against each other if you accept a job that's below this prevailing wage. And so that's one potential explanation. And then we have some work in the field right now that's trying to understand the mechanism for rationing. So who gets picked first and who gets rationed out, right? And so we have this hypothesis that it's really the most productive worker that gets picked first. And so the lemons in the village who are still, whose marginal product is still above W are really the ones who end up getting hit badly by rationing.
Oh, that's so interesting, because without having any local context of this, I would have guessed that there would have been some sort of social insurance, like rotation systems happening. But that's really fascinating. I'm excited to see that future work. I'm going to go to
payments and stuff, but that's something that we're exploring right now.
I'm going to go to some questions from the chat. So from Daniel, would labor demand also be changed by shifts in labor supply? It might change other wages in the village and demand for goods in the village. And so as one example, as I was reading this question, I was thinking of is, what if, for instance, as you extract these people, demand for food every day goes down? How do you think that'll play out? I'm just extrapolating off of the question that was asked. Hopefully that was the direction it was going.
So you're saying if we take, so just to clarify, we take people out in terms of they work in these external factories, but they go back to their village every day. So it's not like we're removing them from the village entirely in this duration. So you're saying, could there be a change?
Like lunch, for example. So you're providing lunch now for these individuals, and they aren't consuming lunch locally anymore. How do you think that would play out in your framework?
Interesting. Well, we are purchasing lunch locally as well, so we're generating that. But yeah, I have to think about this question harder. Daniel, I don't know if if you had something different in mind from what Mike is suggesting.
Daniel, just turned on your microphone. Daniel, it's turning off your microphone. Sorry, Daniel, I'm not sure what's going on with your microphone, but you're creating some feedback. If you have follow-up on your question, please put it in the chat. I'm going to read Alok's question now. So
Okay.
how do we think about labor demand elasticity in peak season? I suspect that potential employment opportunities for workers in on farms and makes the demand very inelastic. If the labor demand in peak season highly inelastic, how should we think about the wage effects purely an artifact of inelastic demand or as evidence of rationing? Yogita, can you see the chat as well? I'm sorry if I
just trying to. So our point is that in the peak season, we don't observe rationing. So I'm not sure I follow your question, Alok, in saying that if the labor demand in peak season is highly inelastic, is that as evidence of rationing? Don't follow.
So Alok, maybe if you want to re-ask your question, get to that in the chat. Another kind of question that I'm going to ask, which is entirely unfair and is going to ask you to extrapolate well beyond your context, but when you're talking about underestimating unemployment or underemployment, I thought about the United States and the role of the gig economy and how this is facilitating people working at effective wages that are below minimum wages and whatnot. What do you think about strategies for studying things like labor rationing within the U.S. in this context and the implications?
So I think one like quick response is if you remember the slide I had about how we measure involuntary unemployment, I think we can do a lot better just in terms of the types of survey questions that we ask. And so it could apply to, for example, people in the gig economy who are willing to work a less than minimum wage if it guarantees them some amount of flexibility, etc. So that actually speaks to some other work I have on flexibility, but it could. I think that's sort of the quick response that I could think about, but I think you're asking for something that's a lot more that I might need to break my head on a little bit longer.
Great, that sounds awesome. I look forward to seeing your future work on that topic. All right, I think that we are basically out of time. Thank you everyone for your questions, to the presenters for their work that they shared with us, and to the H2D2 moderators and organizers. They've done a really amazing job in a very challenging situation. So I'm just gonna, on behalf of everyone, give you all a round of applause. Thank you and have a great day.
Thanks so much, Mike.